Trying to run the sound system and talk at the same time, so it works only so well. Okay, so this past semester for school, we had to give a presentation or a paper. Move away from that mic because that mic's still on our church and our church history. So I talked to Marv for a while and Kristen for a little bit, and I also called Dan Whitmer and talked to him. And this is my paper on what I could gather from our church history and my reflections on that. So, in the early 1830s, after the first Mennonites moved to Pennsylvania, they came and settled in the Wayne County area. These settlers planted two church buildings, one in the Dalton-Orville area. They called one Pleasant View Mennonite and the other one Martin's Mennonite. At that time in history, travel wasn't real good yet, and so they met at one church one week and one church the other week so that the people that lived close to one didn't have to travel near as far. Most of the people who attended were farmers, and the pastor of the church was William Westhofer. He was the only ordained minister in the area at the time. As more people began to come to the Wayne County area, a man named Jacob Whistler came and greatly affected the Martin's Mennonite and Pleasant View Mennonite church. It caused a separation between the two churches, and a group broke off and built a church. I think it was right beside Martin's. Somehow that worked, and the other church met at where County Line Mennonite is now, and they also alternated where they met each week. Eventually, Chestnutridge built a church here, and we met here and at County Line still, so that distance wasn't as great a problem. As time passed, though, in around 1950, a deacon from the congregation, Harry Landis, left along with 40 other members. These members became the original members of the Chestnutridge Church. The people of the newly formed church were now in favor of things like Sunday school and revival meetings and having lights in the church and stuff like that had previously separated them from the Martin's church. When I talked to Dan Whitmer, he mentioned that revival meetings were a really big thing, especially for the younger members in the church, and especially in his walk of faith, they helped him to grow stronger. The first service was held in 1953 at Chestnutridge. Then in 1950, we started to talk about what conference we wanted to be affiliated with. The church decided to join Virginia Mennonite Conference, and during this time, we worked closely with Sonnenberg and the other churches that were affiliated with Virginia Mennonite Conference. At the start, there was no minister of the church, and so they just alternated who preached. Somebody would preach this Sunday, and somebody would preach the next, till eventually in 1955, Frank Nice was ordained as pastor of the church. During Frank's time, he decided to go to college in Virginia at EMU, or Eastern Mennonite College at the time. And he went there for 2 years. Meanwhile, Clayton Swartzentruber stepped in and was the pastor. Frank came back then and pastored for 7 more years, but then he moved to North Carolina and started a congregation in Durham. The next pastor was Andy Hartzler. The church grew a lot over this time. It was apparent that more space was needed, and that's when this building here was built. The first service in the new addition was preached by Dan Whitmer, and it was in April of 1976. Andy Hartzler was an evangelist and preached in a prison ministry and possibly some other ministry things that he did around the area. He was really well respected among the congregation, and people liked him a lot. But then in 1977, he suddenly died of a heart attack. The next pastor was Glenn Steiner. Glenn continued Andy's heart for mission in our church, and some of the other members really had a heart for the community in North Canton. And so in 1984, Glenn and like 25 to 30 people left to plant a church up in North Canton, which is now Dayspring Mennonite. This provided another good connection and was that we could start with that community up there. After Glenn left, the next pastor was Phil Carnegie. This time, Marvin talked about how strong the youth ministry became at this time in the church. And he talked about the church would hold like 2-week-long Bible studies at the church, and a lot of people were involved with the youth. Quite a few helped with Bible studies, but some helped as youth group sponsors and were able to impact them there. Some of the people had a heart for the community of North Lawrence, and after the church services on Sundays, they would go to North Lawrence and hold a movie night, and others would help with reaching out to the nursing homes and rescue mission in Barberton. This was a really healthy time for the church, and the church was pretty strong at this point. Phil was also very loved, but again, he moved away to Virginia in 1992. After Phil was Ron Williams. Ron was not a pastor very long. Ron had a real heart for the community and worked on connecting the surrounding area. There was I couldn't really find what the problems were, but there was some tension that he caused with the church, and eventually caused a split, and started a new congregation called the Dove Congregation that met at the YMCA in Downton. And this time in the church history was a particularly tough time because of the kind of rough tension and rough split that happened. The next pastor was Elno Steiner. He and his wife were experienced pastor's family from when they were pastors at Pleasant View. And they were able to really add some stability after the tough time and split that they had when the Dove congregation split out. But soon a replacement, he was just like an intern pastor, and soon a replacement, Bruce Hampshire took over. Soon after he took over, though, he left to preach for Berlin Mennonite, and the next pastor came from Heston College. His name was Robert Yutzi, and Robert was a young man, and a lot of people in the church thought he had the potential to stay for a while, but after like a year or two, he didn't feel like God was calling him to preach here anymore. And so he made his spot more of an intern spot, and the church started another pastoral search, and that's when Marv was asked to become the pastor of Chestnutridge. Marvin started in 2003 and has been pastor to the present, as we all know. Marvin grew up in the congregation and has tried to continue the ministry focus that the church was strong at with one point. Early on in his term, the church had started a discerning process to change what conference the church would be affiliated with. That process took a few years to decide, and the congregation had started to lose the benefits that was previously a part of Virginia Conference, and that's when we decided to become part of Ohio Conference. It gave us more of a connection with the churches in the community and some other benefits. Since the switch to Ohio Mennonite Conference, the church has been in a hard spot, and numbers and participation have gone down. Over time, we have been able to mend and gain the relationships with the surrounding churches. We still meet with Martin's and Pleasant View on Easter and Thanksgiving, and two churches that we previously split from. And the youth group is meeting with Crown Hill, Martin's, and Salem, and Pleasant View. We are now close to from 30 to 35 people, or 30 to 50 people, and just because our numbers have gone down, the people have not changed. Our congregation still enjoys worshiping and meeting together, and we still have our yearly corn roast and our barn party. For my reflections on it, one of the things that I took away from this project was the realization that our church is bigger than it seems. It is bigger than our building and bigger than the people that meet here. And our church is part of the community in Canton and in Virginia and North Carolina. Our church is part of MCC and the Quilting Corner and the Relief Sale and different organizations around the area. And no matter what happens to our church in the future, I have faith that our church will still have a presence, no matter if it's here or wherever it is, that there's parts of us everywhere. So now my dad will talk a little bit.
You know, it always takes work to do those projects, but there's some good projects. So Elijah got to share some today about the history of Chestnut Ridge, and I get to continue on with the future of Chestnut Ridge. Well, we'll kind of start to explore it anyhow. So what I'd like to do is spend a couple minutes just looking at the scripture for today and exploring that a little bit, and then just talk a little bit about where we move from here. I was thinking about Elijah sharing about the history of the church here, and I was thinking, where in the New Testament are there places that there was history lessons given where they drew back and learned from history? And so one of the places was where our scripture's from today, from Hebrews 11. That chapter, I saw one place it was referred to the Hall of Faith, talking about the faith of the people who brought us to where we are at today. And so I'm going to share just a little bit about this passage in Hebrews. The book of Hebrews was written to a group of people who had faced a lot of persecution. And they were still in the midst of this persecution. And the writer was trying to encourage them, was trying to help them to stick with their faith. Some of the theologians disagree a little bit on exactly, like, the people were thinking about going back to Judaism at that time. They had become Christians, they were thinking about going back to Judaism, And so the writer of Hebrews is saying that's not what this is about. That's not what you should be doing. We need to follow Christ. And we're not sure if it was because of the intense persecution they were experiencing, or if it was because of just other Jewish leaders in the area that were trying to convince them to come back again, or just that that's what they had felt comfortable with growing up, and so they were thinking about returning. But anyhow, they were thinking of returning back, and so this book was written for that purpose of keeping them with the Christian faith. So then that brings us to chapter 11, where if you read down through chapter 11, you hear by faith, by faith, by faith, over and over again. Anybody know how many times it says by faith in that chapter? 20 times it says by faith. And so I started thinking a little bit, okay, by faith. Obviously, this is being emphasized if you're going to use it 20 times in one chapter. So what was the big thing about by faith that we were trying to get at, that the writer was trying to get at? And Jim just read part of the chapter. The chapter is 40 verses long. He read the first 16. So it continues on. We heard about, by faith, Abel offered to God. By faith, Abraham obeyed. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid for 3 months. By faith, people crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land. It talks about by faith what the prophets did and the judges. And so I was thinking a little bit, what exactly does faith mean? I was questioning a little bit about what's the difference between belief and faith. Anybody know what the difference is between belief and faith? Go ahead, Dan.
Belief is you think that the chair will hold you.
Uh-huh.
Faith is you sit in the chair.
Uh-huh. Very good. Very good. Because the more research I did into it, there is a definite difference between belief and faith, and exactly what Dan is talking about. Another example of that would be somebody who wants to go parachuting. You believe that the parachute will hold you and gently take you down to the ground. Faith is what makes you step out of the plane. And so, these people that were mentioned here in these scriptures, by faith, it wasn't just they thought this, it wasn't just a head knowledge thing, it is that that was what they had their faith on. That's what they rested on. That's what they risked everything for, was their faith. Now, I also read about, people sometimes change their beliefs some, but when a person changes their faith or deepens their faith, you see their life change. And so that is what the writer here is pointing out, that in the history, back through the Old Testament on up through, faith in God was the most important thing. That's what everything was based on. That's what people relied on. That's what people devoted their life to. That's what made them who they were. One of the other things I found interesting in this chapter kind of mixed into this whole faith thing as well, is what the people, each person was talking about, what they kind of experienced via their faith. And I'm going to read a couple verses here. A couple of them Jim already read. First of all, I'm going to go verses 13 through 16. These all died in faith, not having received what was promised, but having seen it and greeted it from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of what the land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he prepared them a city. And then verses 39 and 40. All these, by these they're talking about all these people that were by faith, though well attested by their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had foreseen something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. And so there's that whole part of the faith thing, like these people lived by faith. They stepped out of the airplane, they gave everything to God. And they didn't always see all the rewards of that or what all was going to come of that. It's kind of similar to what Elijah was saying back through Chestnut Ridge's history. That there's many things that happen along the way, and people at the time they stepped out on faith, but they didn't know what was going to happen from it. I mean, Elijah talked about Day Spring in Canton. It's a wonderful thing that's happening there, and people worshiping God there that has changed many lives. And you can go down through over and over again that by faith these things are done. So as I look at our congregation and where we go from here, what are the next steps for us here? What do we need to do by faith in trusting in God with where we are at? And a couple weeks ago, we had a meeting together, and I was very encouraged by the meeting in just not necessarily the beginning parts that Michelle and I were sharing. The part that was encouraging to me was your sharing. And the way you shared, the openness, the questions that we asked, I was encouraged by, nobody really felt the need to answer somebody else's question or to maybe correct something. It was a time of sharing what we are experiencing. And as we move forward together, I just think it's going to be so important that we are able to continue to share what we are hearing from God and where God is leading us, so that by faith we can step out and do what God is calling us to do. I gotta make sure I didn't miss a couple things here. Another thing that we heard in the meeting that we had when you were sharing, there was a lot of people, I don't know if you were copying off of each other or, no, it was genuine. We don't know the answer. That phrase was used a lot of times. I don't know the answer. And some of it was, I don't know the answer of what has brought us to where we are at today, and I don't know the answer of where we are to go tomorrow. And, but just to acknowledge that we are seeking an answer is important for us. And another thing that was expressed at that meeting as well is how much people value this church and being their home. God has been working among us here for many years. And, you know, I'm younger to the congregation here. But for a lot of people, this is home, this is what we know, and we value that a lot. So, moving forward from our discussion that we had, and just realizing the situation that we are in, and we've been talking some about our numbers being low and it being harder for us to do church the way we used to. I mean, one of the changes that we've made recently is Marvin going to 3/4 time. And so, as the elder team, you know, we've been talking about this for a while now. You know, what is God calling us to do? And I think one of the things God is calling us to do is for us to work together to listen to God and to share what we are hearing from God. You know, God talks through different people at different times in life, and it's not always just the leader of the church that he talks through. God talks through a lot of people. And so it's going to be very important that we all listen for God's leading and share that with each other, and that we together find out what is next. I'm going to list some different things that we have talked about, because I think it's important that we realize there are options, there are good things that God could call us to do. And I think I stated at the meeting we had earlier too, wherever God leads us is going to be good. And it's going to help us to grow in faith. Whether it is, well, I'm going to list some different things. Some different options that we have are to continue to do church the way that we have been, even though, you know, Marvin's gone down 3/4 time and something like that. We could continue just to try and hope that some things change. Another option would be for us to, with a smaller congregation, to move to more like a house church sort of a situation where we meet in a small group more and redesign how we do things. And in a house church situation, I don't know if whether you have a paid pastor or not or whatever. I mean, just different things. Another option we have is to close the doors and sell this building and have somebody else, another group that's looking for a church to worship here, is another option that we have. We've talked before about the possibility of combining with another church or a couple churches, and worshiping in a setting like that. Another thing that would be similar to that, Elijah shared how at one time Chestnutridge and County Line, met here one Sunday, met over there the next Sunday, met here. I mean, we could do, there are creative options out there that we can maybe do something like that. We could move to a worship format where it's more leading from the congregation. You know, Elijah and I are sharing this week, and we thought we'd put your names in the hat for the next time Marvin's not preaching and see who wants to share next. No, seriously, there are other ways of worshiping, and like even another idea that we had too was, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bible Study Fellowship. Has anybody been part of Bible Study Fellowship? Okay. Bible Study Fellowship has a very rich, nurturing Bible study that they do. And even to do something like that as a congregation, there could be a tremendous amount of growth and that can happen from that thing as well. So we have options, and I have faith that God has good options in store for us. A lot of what we have to do is listen to God and work together and actively continue to discern that. Not to sit back and say, well, let's see what God does. I think we need to continue to be active in listening to God and sharing with each other. I think as we move forward, that we need to keep on in front of us what is important to our church. Missions has been important to Chestnut Ridge from the first day on. And so keeping that in front of us, and how can we be a mission to Christ's kingdom. I think we also need to maybe even have some specific designated times for prayer where either we can meet together for prayer or just have more intentional times of prayer where we as a congregation ask God for leading on where we are to step next. I think it would be good for us to have some more discussions like we had a few weeks ago, where we can share whether it's these ideas that I was talking about here or other ideas that you have, what we need to do. There's other opportunities to discuss the church, even in meeting together for a meal and having a discussion around a table of what we can do. So I'm inviting you for a couple different things. Most importantly is to have faith that God is going to lead us closer to Him, and that we can share that with those around us, no matter what format that we decide to do that in. And that we need to actively work on doing that together. We are going to open up for sharing here, and during the sharing time, I welcome you to share reflections or thoughts from what Elijah said about the history. I'm sure there's much more that can be added yet, but you're welcome to share things related to that or how you've seen the faith of those before us has brought us to where we are today. Or you can also share reflections on where we're at and where we're going as well. So I want to open it up for a time of sharing, and then Jim and Carolyn will finish things up from there.